Been vegan since 1997. I was vegetarian in 1993. I first went vegetarian. I was 14 years old, and I made that decision mainly because I worked at a soup kitchen, and there was a group that came to my high school called Youth for Environmental Sanity, and they found out that I was working at the soup kitchen. They said, "Don't you feel it's kind of hypocritical that you care so much about relieving world hunger and helping people that are hungry, and yet you're consuming animals where the amount of resources that go into consuming animals are as much as 12 pounds of grain and 40 gallons of water for a cow to gain a single pound of muscle mass. So if you're eating a 1 pound steak, that can be extrapolated to possibly feeding 20 people a meal of pasta. And that's not a great way, sustainability-wise, to think about dealing with world hunger as a problem. Started my life of activism really young because of my mother. My mother was kind of like an ex-hippie. She introduced me to a bunch of really interesting stuff, especially ecology and environmentalism at a really early age. She always encouraged me to root for the underdog and always fight injustice wherever I see it. And so she had a really positive impact on my life. I made a choice when I was really young to get involved with a group called NYPIRG and the Nature Conservancy, going door to door, trying to lobby for, I think real quick, is something called the Pesticide Registry Bill. And the Pesticide Registry Bill was a bill that would help notify neighbors when pesticides are being sprayed, and also help collect census data to show that pesticides like organochlorines and organophosphates might be causing breast cancer. We had a family friend who passed away because of breast cancer, and I kind of pledged my activism to that. And along the way, being involved with these groups, going door to door, I met new people, learned about new social justice issues, whether it be protests with Amnesty International, etc. But it wasn't until my first year in college that I met a group of people through the hardcore punk scene. They introduced me to the hardcore punk scene. I didn't even know what it was because of my activism. And they brought me there with them, and I met people that were into things like anti-sweatshop protests. And while embedded in this group working on anti-sweatshop work, somebody asked if we wanted to go on an undercover investigation into an animal facility. It was a dairy farm. And I remember kind of jumping the fence to go film, and I kind of maybe did it for the wrong reasons. I did it because I thought it was cool to kind of little B&E, go inside a place and shoot some footage, like Mission Impossible style. And I remember that by the time I got there, it kind of changed my whole life. I was already vegetarian, but that's what motivated me to go vegan, is considering the way that animals are treated in dairy facilities, and that I had no idea up until that point that dairy is somehow conjoined with the veal industry. I was always against veal from the moment I was born. I had no idea that the two industries supported each other. And my moral constructs changed at that point, and I realized that the voice of animals was a minority voice, and I started leaning more towards animal rights activism in my activism. People really like to label themselves as something. So a lot of people say, or they want to identify, I'm a socialist, or I'm an anarcho-syndicalist, or I'm an anti-capitalist, or I'm a communist. Whatever it may be, labels aren't really important. I often critique capitalism because capitalism, by its very nature, creates an imbalance. And it's an imbalanced system that allows people that are predatory to succeed and other people that are docile to fall behind. And so it encourages you to stay on top through this economic food chain to always be predatory. Well, unfortunately, an imbalanced system like capitalism brings out the worst in people and brings out the worst in business, and sometimes can reward bad practice in large institutions like factory farms. I don't really believe that a farm owner, by his or her very nature, is an evil person. So if a farm owner is trying to make profit and they end up making the size of their cages smaller because they can increase their profit margins, I believe that this is a measure of capitalism. Capitalism is kind of forcing their hand to make smaller cages, to de-beak animals and everything else, because it saves them money. It allows them to, limit their resources and increase their profit margins. In that sense, capitalism rewards bad behavior. What we have, though, is we have, especially within the animal rights movement, this tendency to reward capitalism because we want to mainstream ourselves in every single sense except for our narrative about animals. Because people are concerned, and I understand the argument, that when you're talking about veganism and animal rights, it seems abnormal. And so you want to be normal in every other sense, and so you don't want to come across as an anti-capitalist. But capitalism, by its very nature, treats animals like shit. And so we need to at least consider capitalism in our narrative in the way that capitalism can hurt animals. And so I'm constantly talking about the way capitalism hurts animals, and the Shack campaign that I was involved with years ago actually specifically was built on a model that looked at capitalism first and identified Achilles' heels, financial pillars of support, and said, we're going to knock out these financial pillars of support in hopes of toppling a multinational company that was hurting animals. I look back on it and I do have some regrets, but overall, one thing I do not regret is what motivated all of us to be involved. We were all motivated by compassion to close down a business that tested on 180,000 animals each year, products that often were making people sick, products that were destroying the environment, doing CRO work for companies that didn't care about humans, didn't care about the environment, and didn't care about animals. I think it was important that we shut that place down. We can learn from the campaigning strategies in the way that we were targeting secondary and tertiary targets financially. We could also learn from some of our mistakes in the sense that some of the more radical or violent rhetoric that was used, and I say rhetoric because it was never acted upon, but some of the rhetoric that was the tone and the tenor in these communiques was something that ultimately hurt the Shack 7 and ultimately hurt the movement as a whole, because it was the government and our opposition and in the media, they would cherry pick what sounded the worst and put together this collage to say this is what Shack is these few bad things put together. They didn't recognize all the great things that it was as well. And so I'd like to at least bolster the great things and encourage people to show some restraint when it comes to some of this overly violent, crying wolf rhetoric. And a pragmatic reason to try and bridge, divides between different social justice movements. The reason why I say that, excuse me, the reason why I say that is because the moral reason is that struggle or oppression is universal. Whether or not a human is oppressed or an animal is oppressed, suffering is suffering. And compassion should be universal likewise. Empathy should be universal likewise. And so if we're able to empathize with each other, or if we encourage people from other movements to start to empathize with the plight of animals, animals that at one point their psychological constructs would tell them are insignificant or non-important, if they're able to identify with the rights of small creatures, they inevitably are going to treat their neighbor better. If you try to encourage someone or educate someone about the rights of a rat, something that they didn't consider before in their life, and they start to accept this ideal, even if it's with a cursory glance, something like racism, homophobia, sexism is going to seem so much more abhorrent to those people, because now they understand and sympathize with the rights of a rat, and a neighbor or whoever, someone from a different gender, a different race, or whatever else that's being oppressed, is someone you can actually identify with and have a conversation with. The opposite end of the table is that from a pragmatic standpoint, oppression and repression of activist movements happens all across the board. And it's important for all of us to come together and fight together because our struggles truly are unified. Not only that, but so often we build communities, and whether it's deliberate or not, we use them as exclusionary devices. So here we have this animal rights clique, and we're all vegan, we all go to the vegan restaurant together, and we all protest together and everything else like that. But because it's cliquey, it has a tendency to impede its own growth. And what we should be spending our time doing is not celebrating our veganism with our fellow vegans all the time, but being in other social circles that aren't necessarily vegan. So if you're with other social justice activists, people that have a tendency to lean left, people that have already started to consider other social justice issues that are, involved with compassion and empathy and identifying with others suffering besides themselves, these people are likely to at least listen to you. And being in conversations with them, talking about the rights of animals, even if it's in a non-confrontational setting, if it's like, oh, this is a veggie burger, this is what I'm eating, I eat it for the following reasons, when asked, you're having subtle influence day in and day out with people that are not vegan, are not vegetarian, and you're slowly changing those people's views. Not only that, but you're changing the world views of people that might be exceptional organizers, and they're going to bring their talents back to the needs of animals as well.